Well, we've just gone 1 o'clock now. I can see that the participant levels have remained the same, so we can catch up with any new ones that sort of join. But today, this is us, Bevan Buckland, giving a very brief guide on risk management for charities and looking at risks across the sector. Just a little bit of housekeeping at the start. We want to make sure that all charities or anyone that these would be of value to are actually sort of receiving invites to them. So if you're able to, can you please just quickly let us know how you actually found out about the webinar? Just so it allows us then to market it or market any sort of future events through the correct channels or going forward. So can you please click on one of the options just so we can keep a look. And from our side, so a little brief introductions. I'm Michael Jones. I'm one of the audit partners here at Bevan Buckland, and I act for a number of charities across South Wales.
And my name's Harry Lloyd Davis. So it's just the two of us today. We haven't got a special guest like Damon, but we do a lot with risk management. So I'm one of Mike's fellow business partners here at Bevan and Buckland. So we felt for the stuff that's been covered today, hopefully the two of us can cover it off nicely. And we want to sort of in particular, I think, discuss some of the current risks that we're seeing, our charities adding to their risk registers to hopefully inform the rest of you as to what sort of things you need to be hopefully having on your risk registers as well.
So looking through, so this is a little contents of what we're going to run through today. So as mentioned, this is a high-level introductory, 30 minutes realistically covering risk management. We are going to do a more detailed workshop later on in the year. So if that is of interest to you, I said there will be flyers and sort of posts sort of sent out later in the year. So please feel free to register. It looks quite a lot there on the run through for today, but out of the 7, the first 5 we probably run through in the first 10 minutes. We're then sort of kind of coming on to sort of sector risks then for the last sort of 20 minutes. We'd like to keep this interactive if people have got any questions. So if you do, can you put them into the chat box, make them available to everyone, and we'll monitor that then throughout the webinar. If we find that the question relates to one of the slides that we're on, we'll answer it as we go through. Otherwise, we'll do a recap then at the end, just to make sure any outstanding questions have been covered. And if you need some further information, we can follow up after this webinar as well. And just to let you all know, everyone that's on the webinar today will also get a copy of the slides and things. So you aren't going to worry about taking notes throughout the webinar. So the things we're going to run through today, why is risk management important? There could be new trustees or new sort of members of staff, linking with charities on this course, so it's something new to you. Who's responsible for it? What requirements are for charities? And then looking more on the risks themselves, how can they be managed? What sort of process you should have to identify the risks and manage the risks. And then we'll come on to the types of risks that we're seeing across the charity sector, especially any some current ones. So that's pretty much a run through for what we're planning this afternoon. So firstly, why are risks important?
Oh, thank you, Mike. And as Mike has said, we're going to keep it high level because there's a mix of people on this course today. Some of you that have been doing risk management for donkey's years, others that are relatively new charities that this is all fairly new to. So it's trying to get the balance right, so it's useful to everyone. But I often sort of look at risk management, and for me, I think the critical thing is that you've got to, as individuals, we all have different risk appetites. And anyone who's ever been to see an independent financial advisor will know that they will have spent hours with you asking loads of different questions so they can sort of prove that they've understood your risk appetite and that they're investing your money appropriately. And that's fairly easy when it's on a one-to-one basis. But when there's a group of you, as there normally are running a charity, you've got to really come to a sort of a more collective risk appetite and trying to understand, well, what's the position that generally all the trustees are fairly comfortable with. And that normally means that, most charities, in my opinion, end up with a risk appetite which is balanced to cautious, I would say. But it's important, really important, that you understand where your risk appetite is so that then, as it says on the slide, you can understand, well, right, what are the risks that we're facing and do they fit within that risk appetite, essentially? And to demonstrate that, I'm not going to name them, but I've had two conversations in the last 2 or 3 weeks about parking tickets, bizarrely, both with sort of senior people within the charitable sector. And one said, "Oh, I never bother buying parking tickets because I've worked out that the number of times they actually get caught and fined is so rare that paying the fine is cheaper than actually all of the other." Um, all of what I would have spent on parking tickets. And then I have another charity who said he said I break out into hives. He's absolutely paranoid about getting a parking ticket, and he's petrified. So he's always panicking anywhere he's going, understanding the parking arrangements, so that if he needs to book in advance or pay for the ticket in advance, he can, to make sure he never ever gets a parking ticket. And I know it's a slightly odd and silly analogy, but it does demonstrate the massive range in two people in fairly similar roles in two different organizations can actually have to something as simple as a parking ticket. And I say that to me demonstrates why risk management is important, because what would be acceptable if one of those people was your boss would in no way be acceptable to the other. And so by understanding, what the risk appetites of individuals and organizations are, it helps you then to hopefully manage those risks appropriately and not have misunderstandings if things happen that people didn't see. So as I say, it does definitely link into forward and strategic planning. Because if you know where you want to get to, and if as a charity you want to grow and expand and do new things, you realistically are going to need to have a more adventurous risk appetite than if your plan as a charity is to sort of consolidate and stay where you are for the next few years. So I think strategic planning and risk management are definitely linked, and it's important that you understand them in that context. And as I say, it's very difficult if you want to sort of take over the world as a charity to do that by being very, very risk adverse. So a little introduction to why it matters, and I'll hand over to Mike, who's going to talk a bit about the legal requirements, hopefully. Or responsibility first.
Yeah, it's so tying it all together. We've got the trustee body, or your board are responsible for running the charity, setting the aims of the charity realistically, and almost safeguarding the assets within the charity. So they will be making the decisions of what sort of risky activities we look to achieve. And it could even come down to how you invest in funds. So if you've got a charity with significant funds, what type of investments do we want to make? Are there any social investments that we shouldn't do just because of how the charity operates? So the trustees themselves, they will be the ones sort of setting what the parameters are for this risk process. You could have across the board of trustees, Harry mentioned, the range of risk appetites. You're likely to have that across the board. So it'll be the board's sort of decision to come together, work out actually how risky we want to be investing, or activities we want to be undertaking, thinking of what could harm the charity, just to make sure that they are considering the charity itself rather than just what their appetite is. And then they'll be responsible then for actually sort of setting the parameters of the risk itself. It doesn't mean they have to undertake the risk assessment process. Yeah. What you'd find is the smaller charities, the trustees tend to get far more involved with the day-to-day work, and they're likely to be the ones working on what the risks are and what safeguards need to get put in place. When you get to larger charities, this will likely be delegated down to senior team or senior staff. But the trustees can't avoid getting involved with it. They have to make sure that they either they set their parameters at the start, and at least review the results to make sure that they're happy with the risks that have been identified, the safeguards that are put in place, just to make sure that the charity itself is being protected. And there's nothing stopping the trustees then actually getting sort of professional advice, just to make sure that they're happy with the outcomes, and to make sure that they are so consistent across the sector. We are dealing with a number of charities, all across South Wales. We're likely to have seen similar risks across, a number of charities, and could we sort of give a bit of guidance on the safeguards that have been used. So if you're unsure, always sort of speak to somebody that's likely to have dealt with charities, just to make sure that you've got that sounding board to come across. But it works as it's one of your initial assessment tools for the board, and it does line up a line of defence that Harry's going to sort of briefly touch upon.
Yes, so the three lines of defense when it comes to sort of controls around risk. So some of you will, I'm sure, be familiar with this sort of diagram, or certainly with the terms of three lines of defense. For others, this will be totally new, and this is probably sort of later down your risk journey. So if you've got good risk registers, good systems in place, then hopefully this is something that's familiar to you. If you're at the stage yet where you've only got a very basic or haven't even got any risk register set up as yet, this is probably not the first thing to worry about. It'll come later down the line. But the three lines of defense is a useful way to understand the concept, and just to sort of try and explain the diagram in front of you. So it's not one of ours. This is something that, it's been around about 10 years now, 10 years or so now, I think. And this was something that was sort of, I think, first put together by the Institute of Internal Auditors. But the principles are on the bottom left there. You can see that your first line of defense essentially is having good controls in place. So to use an example, if the risk or the thing that you're worried about as trustees is, well, what if one of the staff makes off with the money in the bank? The control you would normally have in place is some sort of dual authorization to make sure no individual can take money out of the bank without colluding with someone else or without having it authorized by someone else. So generally, the first line of defense against any risk is to have some sort of control in place, like two people having to authorize a payment. But then the second line, and again, this falls within the management's responsibility, is to actually have some sort of monitoring and challenge on risk-related matters. So it's not, it's all well and good having the control, but if that control isn't actually operating effectively, if no one is checking to make sure that actually is it the case that no one can transfer money out without a second person doing it, or making sure that it doesn't actually happen in practice, just that first line, just having the control on its own isn't really enough. So generally, the best solution is to have the good controls, but then have them monitored periodically by the management team to give you the confidence that they are operating effectively. And then the third line, which is where you will certainly would want to aim to get to if you're a bigger organization, is then you get that work essentially. You get those controls and the monitoring of those controls reviewed by a third party, normally an internal audit organization, who would come in a few times during the year, look at your controls and the monitoring of them, and make sure all of that is operating effectively. So if you hear people talking about the three lines of defense when it comes to internal controls and those things being used to manage risk, that's what they're going on about. It's the good controls, the internal monitoring of those controls, and then effectively the external monitoring of those controls through internal audit. And just quickly, as I say, all of those different organizations, normally a good practice is to report back to the governing body, the trustees, so that they are happy that everything is running as it should be. And then as a final step, if you are big enough that you need an external audit, the external audit will hopefully provide some additional assurance, almost like a fourth line of defense, that all of that is operating correctly. So as I say, that's sort of probably a bit higher level stuff today, but certainly something that's worth looking into if you're one of the bigger charities who's well along your risk management journey.
Frozen. The way this also links together, you've got your requirements. As the charity grows, you find that the reporting requirements become more and more. Large charities that need to have their accounts audited need to actually have a risk management statement in the trustees report. The wording sort of noted on screen there, but you are looking at the type of risks that will have either a major impact, and either be probable or highly probable of likelihood of occurring. And it will cover a number of areas. It'll be governance, operations, finances, environmental external factors, and compliance with laws and regulations. That's sort of typically the areas they'd want you to focus on. But they want to make sure that there are things that are going to have almost a catastrophic effect on the charity. We know across the sector, cuts to government funding is a risk. We're sort of seeing it across a number of charities. So the impact on that happening would be major if you're having close conversations with the government and they're giving you good feedback that it's unlikely to happen. Whilst it would have a major impact, it's not going to be a major risk because you've had your funding confirmed for a couple of years. So it's always something to monitor. not necessarily report on, but there will be charities sort of dealing with sort of vulnerable people, that there will be certain conditions that they have to meet, whether that's sort of compliance with care standards, whether it's sort of education. And actually, if you failed, an inspection there, that could actually almost close the doors to the charity the day after. So it's making sure that you monitor anything that would have an ultimate sort of stop to at that point. How we mentioned audits then for charities, current thresholds, £1 million or more income, or if you've got significant assets, income over 250,000. So that is a requirement to have that in your accounts. For smaller charities, we'd always recommend that you at least have the risk management process in the background. If you wanted to give additional disclosure, you can make that as part of your accounts as good practice anyway. But this isn't an area that it only applies to large charities. This is something that you should be sort of bringing in as good practice from the start, just to make sure that you are embedding, the right risks, and the right control procedures, throughout the charities. So as a charity grows, it's embedded within the organisation. So it's, whilst the risks may double, the process should be quite standard.
So I'm going to touch sort of briefly on how risk can be managed, to sort of talk you through the process now. And this is probably, this 7-point slide is really what we're going into a lot more detail on the workshop later in the year, and going through each step in a lot more detail and doing some practical examples. But it's useful at this stage, I think, to just understand or remind ourselves of what the process is and how you do it. So step one, identify the risks. So, look at your organization. What are the risks that you face as an organization? And we'll touch on this probably a bit later on, but it's critical that that's not something that's done by one person. It really needs to be a sort of a whole organization process involving the trustees, the staff, the volunteers, possibly even the beneficiaries. It is often something that's sort of delegated to the HR person or the finance person, but it really needs to encompass the whole organization to capture all of the risks correctly at the beginning. And then once you've got sort of what those risks are, you then have to analyze them. And the way you analyze them is you ask two questions, essentially. Number one is, how likely is this risk going to hit us? And some things were, depending on how far you want to take this, one of the risks that most of us face is, a meteorite could come out of the sky and destroy our building. But most of us would probably accept that the likelihood of that is probably so remote that we can leave that particular risk off the list. So there are other things like a potential cut to funding or whatever else that might be far higher up that list, which will definitely get on there. But then you need to understand, well, for each of those risks, it's not just how likely is it to happen, but what would be the impact if it did happen. So, if you were to lose one of your major funding sources, then that's going to have a huge impact on the organization. You may have another risk, which, if although it's more likely to happen, let's say losing a member of staff, actually the impact potentially would be lower, or something you can deal with more carefully. So you effectively give both the likelihood and the impact a score, and then multiply those two together. And there's a few different formulas that can be used to do that, to give yourself an overall rating for each of those risks. And then once you've got that rating for each of the risks, you can move on to stage 3, which is to prioritize them. So effectively order them from what's the biggest problem, what's the biggest issue risk, down to the lowest issue risk, and then start to work your way down that list, trying to understand where you sit. And this comes back to, why is it important in the first place? So step 4 is then to determine your appetite for risk. So at some point, you as a group are going to have to decide, you'll have a list of risks, essentially, probably scored from something like 1 to 25, as in how big an issue it is. And at some point on that list, you're going to have to sort of, draw a line and say, well, actually, we're happy with everything that's under maybe 15 or maybe under 10, but everything above that number, we've got to do something about it. And that is essentially how the process works, is you score each of the risks, and then you draw the line and say, right, what can we now do to get this risk, which is currently sat, let's say, at 20, how do we get that risk down to below 15 or below 12 or whatever you've set the bar at, so that we can live with it. And that's where you will look at sort of, controls, and things you can put in place to try and reduce that risk. And normally that's where you start. You ask the question, right, what can we do? And it might be something, if it's a financial risk, as I say, you know, the example I used earlier about, you know, bank payments, you might put some additional checks and balances in place to reduce the chance of someone being able to steal the money, and that might get the risk down to an acceptable level. But there are other things, a lot of risks, you know, there's no real way to avoid them. So you often end up insuring the risk. So that's the best way to remove the risk or get it to an acceptable level, is to put some insurance in place. Sometimes you know, you get to the stage you just can't do anything about it. And the only answer really is to avoid doing, if you're not happy that it's worth doing it, you just say, well, we're going to stop doing that. It's, you know, some risks you say, well, actually the risk of doing that is just too great. We're not going to bother doing that anymore. And the last, I think, probably, you know, solution is you just live with it. And I was thinking, when I was preparing this webinar, you know, there are probably a large number of volunteers and aid workers out in Gaza at the moment who are risking their lives every day. And, you know, when you put it into that context, there are, you know, the charities who are supporting those individuals. You know, there's probably no way you can totally get rid of the risk of those individuals being seriously injured or even killed if they are providing those, you know, those charitable services effectively in a war zone. And so at some point in those organizations, they've probably taken the decision, actually, the risk to individual life is probably, you know, that they've essentially accepted that risk and have taken the decision that the impact and the benefits they can give to the beneficiaries outweighs the risk of death. So it's again, an extreme example, but I think sometimes those extreme examples help us to understand how you have to balance that. And I'm sure they are, obviously those charities are doing absolutely everything they can to get the controls and the other steps to get the risk as low as possible. But sometimes you get to a stage where you can't reduce it any further. And then the last couple of steps, to give some assurance. So, you know, a good process then is, you know, once you've gone through the process, done all that good work, is to feed back to the trustees, and have some sort of checks done on those different controls to make sure that they are operating effectively, so the trustees know, yeah, you know, those I feel like the post control risk levels are fair. And then, you know, monitoring and review. And that's a critical thing. And part of the reason we're here today is when it comes to risks, you've got to constantly go through them, and reevaluate them to make sure they're still up to date. So hopefully that's a quick, or as quick as I can do it. But as I say, that we can probably spend a lot more time on that later in the year when we go through the workshop.
Thanks, Harry. So this is a little bit of a, you know, a recap on what we just sort of run through. It's a case of, you know, the entire charity must sort of commit to the process. You know, you can't just force this on people. You want to get it embedded across the department. And Harry's mentioned, you know, it's not just the finance team. You know, it's anything that's across the organisation. So if you've got every member of staff into a room and ask them what they see the risks for the organisation, you know, you'll have your finance team and they'll be looking at your payments to wrong suppliers. There'll be, you know, somebody not getting paid. You could then have, you know, someone that would be an admin or sort of receptionist. You know, the risk to them would be that, you know, they get locked in the office or the mail doesn't arrive. And then you could have a care worker, and you know, the risks to them would be, you know, single worker risks rather than what the finance team are. So it's a get everyone involved. You know, what you'll often find is that somebody that you wouldn't have expected will come up with a risk that you wouldn't have thought of, and actually it could be a, you know, almost a showstopper to the charity. So, you know, let's make sure they all get sort of captured. You know, it's not all financial. They may well be a financial output at the end of it. You know, whether there's an insurance claim or sort of claim against the charity. So the end result may be financial, but the initial risk wouldn't be. So just make sure that you sort of do identify the risks, as Harry mentioned. Look at the likelihood, you know, and the impact on the charity. Pull together a risk register. Try and put, you know, a review action or a control action in place just to make sure that you can do whatever you can to protect yourself against that risk, and make sure it is regularly updated. What we find when we go through and review registers, you know, we would probably look at risk registers in sort of 2020, 2021 that didn't have COVID-19 on. You know, we were sort of 2 years into the pandemic and people didn't have it on the register. So it shows that it may well have been done, the board or the senior team may well have changed. The document was almost parked on the shelf and was never revisited. And conversely, we're probably looking at risk registers now that have still got COVID-19 on. I think COVID-19 was 4 years ago. So this should be a live document. This should be something that is probably one of your quarterly meetings per year, just to make sure that we are reviewing the risk register. Is it up to date? Especially where you've got a significant amount of short-term funding. If your government funding is only 12 months, you want to be making sure that you are reviewing it at least every sort of 6 months, just to make sure that if that funding was stopped, what do we do next? The last you want to have is funding be cut, and then realistically, as soon as funding gets cut, you're not really sure how to operate the charity. So it gives the trustees that extra tool just to make sure they can perform their duties and safeguard the charity. So that's the overall on what risk management itself was. So just to give a little flavour now for the risk that we're seeing, so the charity sector facing, we're trying to look at it for the wide environment across the charity. So again, not just financial, but there will be a financial climate as to how it impacts the charity. Potentially what operational challenges we're seeing, what technological challenges we're seeing, and what the society and its attitude are having an impact on the charity itself. And Harry mentioned, some risks can be avoided by insuring against them. Some are required, whether it's employer's liability, building insurance, car insurance, to make sure you are safeguarded. But lots of the risks that we've touched upon wouldn't necessarily be insured against. But it gives you an idea for starting those conversations of I went on this. Hopefully, I went on this webinar. They mentioned this. Is it something we've even thought about? If not, let's almost start again. And let's make sure we are capturing them all.
So I'm going to kick off and just talk about what we're seeing financial challenges wise. The first thing I just wanted to touch on was really cut to or upcoming cuts to government budgets. No one will. I hope everyone will be aware that there is an election very soon. But what I've read from a number of the different commentators, looking at the sort of the forward is that whatever happens in that election, whichever party ends up in power, there's almost certainly going to have to be some sort of restraint in terms of government spending. And I suppose the truth is, in reality, since the pandemic, there has been, the taps have been a little bit more turned on in terms of government spending, dealing with all the impacts of COVID. And what I think the Office of Budget Responsibility and the various sort of think tanks that review government spending are saying is that in all the different parties, whoever gets in, even if they do put up taxes, that on its own is not going to be enough, and there's going to have to be some sort of government spending restraint. And what we know is that in reality there are a number of government sort of departments that are generally protected, the NHS and defence being two of the most common ones. And that unfortunately means that if there is government spending, it normally falls disproportionately on all the other areas, which could mean that we're in a fairly tough financial position over the next few years. So if you're reliant on government or other public sector funding, and you're not, you haven't got that one on your risk register, I think you probably need to get it on there, because it is coming. Mike, I've lost my my shared screen, or I've lost you as well, Mike, I think. So hopefully Mike will rejoin us shortly. The sort of the next point in terms of the sort of financial impact or the financial risk that we're seeing as a big concern is costs. And you will not be unaware, anyone personally or in the charity, that unfortunately costs have gone up significantly in the last few years, and that means that for all of us as charities, it is more difficult to get things done. So you need to bear that in mind. That sorry, I'm just going to try and see if I can find out where Mike is. See if I can let him back in or anything. But yeah, so as I say, financially, I think, higher costs are with us to stay. I can't see us going through a period of deflation and those costs going back down. So, again, I suspect whether they're on the risk register or not, you're almost certainly going to have something in there about, you will be aware of where the cost pressures are in your particular charity at the moment. So that's something you need. And the one that, is hurting a lot of charities at the moment is minimum wage. We don't obviously know what's going to happen next year, but we've had 2 or 3 very, very high years of minimum wage. That's something to bear in mind. And then the last one is, the other side of that cost of living crisis, or the increased cost of living, is that, household budgets have got less money. So if you are a charity that is reliant on public donations, there's a very good chance that, you're going to find it harder to get that income in, particularly the sort of the discretionary ones, because households have got less money to put in. So those are sort of 3 of the more common ones that we're seeing creeping into people's risk registers at the moment on the finances. So if they're not, they may not all apply to your specific charity, but they are certainly things I would try and get on there in some description and discuss to see if it has an impact. And I think Mike is back, which is just in time, Mike, because you're covering the next 2 lots, I think.
I know. Yeah, I don't know what happened there. My Zoom literally just sort of disappeared on me. You disappeared off the screen, and everything sort of stopped working. So
I think we were all here, so yeah, welcome.
yeah. So onto operational now. We've picked up sort of three main ones there. Volunteer shortages. There's probably a couple of different sort of reasons why this is sort of happening. The traditional sort of pool of retirees would sort of volunteer. I think less people are doing it. I think what we've found is the impact of COVID seems to have sort of stopped this. Whereas pre-COVID, people would go and volunteer. They'd go and sort of help out in their local organization. When charities have changed and suddenly they haven't got an office anymore and they've gone remote, it seems to have stopped, part of the volunteers sort of coming across. And, linking on with financial, I think what we're also seeing is that where funding cuts have sort of been made, more charities now rely on volunteers. So whereas you'd have one volunteer would almost give their entire spare time to one organization, they're now helping sort of 2, 3, 4 organizations. So, you're only getting sort of 20, 30% of the time that you would have had previously. So, yeah, it is impacting charities that way. Digital transformation, I think everything is now trying to get young donors involved. It is now having to have social media presence. It is having to get some websites and content all done to target younger donors and sort of younger demographic. Traditionally, we find that charities potentially haven't got these skills in house. They're normally very good at the typical service that they provide, but having sort of a marketing arm or sort of a digital arm isn't something that historically they've had in there. It's not something that would typically get part of of co-funding or project funding. So trying to find a way of transforming to engage with the changing demographic is becoming a challenge. And what we're seeing, especially for larger charities, what they're required to report on is increasing. They're going to have to be reporting on equality, diversity. They're looking at reporting now on sort of carbon footprint and social impact. So trying to make sure that you are actually recording this information isn't something that charities have had to do before. I know it's a case of, have we got systems and processes in place to capture the information that we're required to provide. And what we can see linking in with the financial is longer term funding is probably going to come down more to what impact your funding will get, rather than just sort of giving you a pot of money to sort of spend. It's going to become more output driven, and there will be a need for reporting on those outcomes. So it'll be a case of, have we got the systems in place to capture all we need to. Technological, we've seen the world change over the last sort of 4 years. We've seen charities that would have a large high street presence, and now they're all going to remote working, and premises have been sold to use the funds elsewhere. So from our side, what are the risks that come with it? When we look from an audit side, we now have to do more looking around IT controls just to make sure that the safeguards are there. So have you got policies and procedures in place for who's maintaining your IT? Where's your IT coming from? Are we keeping the information safe when doing remote working? Does anyone know what systems are being used in the house and who's got access to machines? there will be charities dealing with very sensitive data, for vulnerable people. So making sure that the systems are as protected as possible, just to sort of safeguard any individual. The last thing any charity would want is to sort of be noted on a data breach where vulnerable information was made public. Linking that in with the IT security, there are different systems. We're seeing organizations being sort of targeted and hacked where they've got old servers, old systems, or the updates haven't been sort of put onto the machines. So it's just making sure that you have got policies there, and whether that's doing it in-house, whether that's engaging an external IT team. I think there's greater emphasis now with the data, especially with GDPR, just to make sure that everyone is safe. And then we've noted threat of AI. So this is sort of noted on here from one aspect. So we've got AI itself is becoming far more realistic. 2 years ago, if you picked up the phone, if it was a robot ringing you, you could quite tell it was a robot. There'd be a significant pause at the start, maybe a very automated message. It wouldn't sound like a real person. We're finding that now, that AI is sounding like the person that it's meant to. There's a number of what they call classes of deep fake articles going around where I think one of the current AI bots actually sounds like I think it's Scarlett Johansson, and there's a legal case ongoing to try and sort of stop that sound going through. So you need to be mindful of AI sort of contacting you. And we've seen an article where AI managed to sort of mock up a Teams meeting to actually sort of get some cash to be transferred. They'd mocked up the videos, they'd mocked up the sound. It sounded like a genuine meeting, even though it wasn't. So there's a threat of AI sort of almost targeting the organization. But then when we were sort of putting this together, we've almost got not embracing AI from a sort of charity point. There will be ways of using AI to get very quick data, to publish articles, to get some research done, or sort of provide advice. So if you're a charity and you're still doing everything manual, and you're using sort of 2 or 3 members of staff to provide help sheets and handbooks, there will be either new charities coming on board that will embrace this to make sure that they can sort of keep their staff costs down to a minimum, or the only way of being able to operate within a reduced budget will be to actually use AI. So the threat of AI is both sides. There's the threat of being targeted by AI and the threat of actually not embracing AI moving forward.
And on that sort of AI, I mean, we've got a board meeting in Bevan Buckland after this, so Mike and I will be there, and we'll be going through our risk register. And AI is probably, in theory, a bigger threat to accountancy than it probably is to most charities. So it is something we monitor very closely. But it's although AI, you can ask questions about sort of these things now, and you'll get an answer which is 80 to 90% right. But it's that critical 10% that it can't master. And we were discussing, I don't know if they'll get that 10% the next year, or it could be 20 or 30 years before they figure out how to do that. So how current a threat, I don't know. And it'll be the same for you and the charities, particularly those that are giving advice and things like that, in theory, some of that work could be done by some sort of bot or online advisor. But it's probably one for me, just monitor it at the moment, make sure you don't get caught out. So the final sort of block of risks that we're seeing sort of being added on to people's risk register at the moment is what we sort of put down as social challenges. And again, these will be very different depending on the type of charity you are, the sector that you work in. But it's always been one of those issues for the charity sector that as finances for the country get more difficult, you find you've got less money coming in, but at the same time, you generally find that there are more people knocking on your door asking for your help and to use your services. So it can be, I always sort of feel any sort of public sector squeeze or recession is doubly hard on the third sector because of that double impact of less money coming in and more people wanting to use your services. So certainly something I think you need to sort of have on your register is there going to be an uptick in demand in the next few years? The second one is something, and we've had this on there for a while, but it does feel, and we've seen this in a few of our sort of different charity risk registers, that the world is becoming more complex, and social issues seem to be more complex. I think poverty, homelessness, domestic violence, all of these things, maybe it's more visible or it's getting reported more, but these issues do seem to be wider. And it's been, I think, demonstrated. Some of you will have seen in the news, there's a lot, I think yesterday and the day before, about special educational needs. And one of the statistics that sort of struck me was, I think, about 2% of the children were in that sector. I think it was about five years ago. That's now grown to, I think, over 4%. So essentially the number of children in special educational needs has doubled in the last 5 to 10 years. And I think, it was asked, is that just a case of better identification and better reporting? And the answer was partly that. But I think there are sort of some fairly complex issues coming out of, I think, probably lockdowns and what happened as a result of the pandemic. But also, it could be, greater use of mobile phones, greater use of the internet. There's an awful lot of quite complex stuff going on in the background. And often I think charities find themselves at the front end of having to deal with all of that. So if you are a charity that deals in some of those areas, I think, you will be aware of this, but I don't think it's a bad thing to put on your risk register. Look, the world is getting more complex. The, cases we may have been able to deal with relatively easily a few years ago are now presenting in a far more difficult manner, which means they're a lot harder to deal with and recognize that as a risk. And the last one, sort of in terms of social issues, is just changing public expectations. Where people are far more demanding now. What is expected of a charity, both in terms of sort of the bigger stuff like transparency, accountability, diversity, as we mentioned there. You're expected, those are just a given. There's no question. But also just responsiveness. In the past it might have been, if you asked a charity for support and they came back to you a week later, you were very grateful. These days it often feels that if you haven't heard back from someone within an hour, then people feel like they've been ignored. So that's difficult. And just being able to maintain that public trust and support when there are so many, for example, social media channels to monitor, etc., etc. You've just got to be very careful. So I think PR and public relations is something you need to sort of have on your risk register, because it's very easy to get wrong if you're not keeping an eye on it. So hopefully there, across those sort of four broad areas, we've given you a bit of a feel for some things that if they're not on your risk register, you probably need to discuss the next time you go through it. But to finish, I'm going to hand back to Mike now, just to go through some of the main messages.
Yeah, so just a few takeaways from today. I said, it's only an introductory course, but just to be mindful that responsibility of risk management does lie with the trustees. But something we've noted a number of times. Just make sure that you do regularly review the risks. Make sure they are updated, especially if we start doing something new. If it's new, it will bring new risks. Let's make sure it's on the risk register. There will be a new government. So chances are some of the risks that are on your register may well need to be at least revised. Depending on what policies get brought in. The Charities Commission themselves, they do provide some very good guidance. So if you want a bit of light reading, go on the Charities and Risk Management CC26 help sheet. That gives far more detail. That'll be sort of what we'll base our workshop on. Obviously, we'll get some live examples on it, but that'll be sort of the core of the course that
Those of you know me know I love the Charities Commission help sheets anyway, but that one I think is a very good one. So I like them all, but CC26 is one of my favorites. So yeah, definitely worth having a look at it if you haven't looked at it before.
And then if you take away one thing from this, it's just remember, it is all teams. So the entire charity has to get involved with this. It's not just financial. Get everything sort of brought together. Get everyone almost in a room. Just let's work out what entire risks are for the charity. And that's probably the key takeaway from today's message. I think there we are, and that's pretty much us. So let's have a quick check of the chat.
I've had a look. I don't think we've got any questions today. So if anyone's got any questions, Mike and myself will hang on for a minute or two, just so if anyone's got any questions, they can ask them. But just I think a huge thank you for logging in today. Hopefully this has been useful. And we'll be running another quarterly webinar in about 3 months' time on our next topic. So, and again, if there's anything in particular that you want us to cover, let us know. Otherwise, we'll be looking for what's topical and relevant, and putting another webinar on for the sector in a few months' time. So thank you all very much.